Thank you for joining us here today, Dr. Elmendorf. And clearly, these are days where your expertise is tremendously needed. So, again, welcome. If I could just return briefly to Mr. Yarmouth's line of questioning, is it reasonable to assume that education spending impacts economic growth?
Yes, I think so, Congressman.
And what about our investment or spending on basic infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the connections we need, the infrastructure to move people and goods around the country?
So we've done some analysis of infrastructure investment, and obviously there are some aspects of that investment that have been more beneficial to the economy and some that have probably not been beneficial at all. But on balance, sensible investments in public infrastructure, investments that pass some sort of benefit-cost test, enhance economic growth.
Asked another way, is there any reason to believe that we might see an economic dip if we don't do some of the investments in education and infrastructure?
So I think so the term dip to me implies a sort of a cyclical effect, and a sharp cut in spending or increases in taxes in the short run would, as I've said before, I think perhaps cause that sort of dip. But usually for people in conversations about education or infrastructure, we're thinking more of the longer term. And I think reductions in the amount of education that occurs in the country, reductions in the amount of infrastructure that we build, would be detrimental to long-term economic growth.
And what about our unemployment, which I've read has a return in economic activity to somewhere between $1.60 to $1.70 on every dollar spent on our unemployment insurance?
So we think that in the short run, in the economy, in the situation of our economy now, where there are a lot of unemployed workers and underutilized factories and equipment, that putting money into the spending stream through benefit payments or reductions in taxes encourages more spending, and that leads to more output and more employment. And in our estimates, the effects of putting money into unemployment insurance is especially powerful because the people who receive it tend to spend a very large share of it since they're people who have lost their jobs and in many cases don't have other sources of income.
It seems as though the economic activity that we need to inspire would at least help that in that unfortunate realm. Can we bring up the charts that we have on our on the long-term debt? There we go. This chart is from Summary Figure 1, I believe. In it, you present, Dr. Elmendorf, two projections of where our debt is headed in the next 30, maybe 35 years. Under both scenarios, debt continues to grow relative to the size of the economy, but there's a tremendous difference between these two line graphs. Yeah. Where do we end up at the end of the chart in 2035 under each scenario in this chart?
So under the extended baseline scenario, which largely follows current law, we end up with debt at 84% of GDP. And under the alternative fiscal scenario, which more closely corresponds to current policy settings, we end up with debt at 187% of GDP in 2035.
Thank you. And can you briefly summarize the key policy choices that differentiate the two scenarios?
Yes. So the biggest difference is on the revenue side. Under current law, because of the expiring tax provisions of last year's health legislation, just the natural interaction of the tax code with economic growth, revenues rise quite a bit relative to GDP. Under the alternative fiscal scenario, we hold revenues, we assume that these expiring provisions are instead extended and keep revenues down closer to their historical average share of GDP. So in 2035, revenues under the extended baseline scenario are 23% of GDP, and under the alternative fiscal scenario are about 18.5% of GDP. There are also differences on the spending side in both the health programs and the non-health, non-social security part of the budget. In the health programs, we are principally assuming under the alternative scenario some of the cost control features of last year's legislation don't continue over the entire quarter century we're showing here. And on the other non-healthcare, non-social security spending, we are assuming still a very substantial decline relative to historical experience, but not quite as stark an endpoint as under the extended baseline scenario.
Well, to summarize, one scenario sticks to current law and puts the debt at about 80% of GDP in 20 or so years, while the other scenario puts that debt at 180% of GDP by, among other things, extending tax cuts for the wealthy and refusing to implement the Affordable Care Act. That sounds to me to be an awful lot like the Republican agenda this year. My concern is that, we're wasting month after month on policy supported by the majority that are merely digging us into a deeper hole. Regardless of how you feel about that best strategy going forward, I think we can all agree that we need to do far better than to create a larger hit.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. Chair.
I ask the gentleman to get back to him in writing if he wishes to do so.